thank you for showing up and dedicating your time to this cause. Normally, I won't say normally, but today's a kind of a unique day because our Lieutenant Governor is actually serving as the acting governor of the state today. So today it's Governor McGeachin, and we will get to some of the decorum and other procedures for the committee as we go. But I wanted to officially let you all know that when she is the acting governor, she has to be invited down to the garden level. And so last night I formally sent her office a letter requesting her attendance at the committee hearing today. So I really appreciate her being here, taking the lead on this task force, and I'm going to turn it back over to her to get started. And I may just make one initial note for you committee members. I've had a couple people ask. So right now you can see the red light is on, and at the bottom of your microphone there's a little toggle switch. And when you have a question, if you just, when you turn that toggle switch on, the red light lights up, and then we can see that you have a question or you're ready to go. And as we get into the introductions, that's also how you turn on your microphone. So, Governor McGeachin.
Thank you so much, Representative Giddings, for that warm introduction. And I just want to say a few words, a few opening remarks about this effort, what this is all about. Back in April 8th, my office put out a press statement discussing the formation of this task force to examine indoctrination in Idaho education and to protect our young people from the scourge of critical race theory, socialism, communism, and Marxism. So that's what the press release that went out on the 8th of April. Since that time, we've had a lot of interest in this task force. We put out a call to action for people that wanted to serve on the committee. We received interest from over 40 people, and then we also established a hotline in the Lieutenant Governor's office for people, the citizens of Idaho, to weigh in and offer their thoughts and their observances. And we have had a tremendous response from the people of Idaho on this issue. And so and I know Representative Giddings will speak to this a little bit more, but we're here to become educated about these important issues and to discuss and make sure that we all understand what it is that's being discussed. So that's the purpose of this committee, and I wanted to thank all of the committee members, the process that we went through to select members on the committee. We had some extensive set of questions. Each person was called, and what we tried to do was get representation from across the state and also representation from different walks of life. And so I want to just say to all of the committee members that are here today, I can't express to you my appreciation for your willingness as citizens of Idaho to come on your own time and your own expense to be a part of this committee. It's quite a humbling experience to know that because of your heartfelt concern about our state, that you're here and willing to serve and step forward. So my thank you to all the committee members. I would like to review rules of decorum before we start. And actually, if Piercy, I also wanted to thank Piercy Robinson, who did serve as an intern for our office, and she is here taking notes, and she will call the roll. And I also wanted to recognize Brooke Berry, who was also an intern in our office, a student at BSU, and we really appreciate both of you for being here and helping us put together all these details of the committee. So, Piercy, if you want to go ahead and call roll. Citizens of Idaho are able to feel that their voice is being heard in a respectful manner. And so there are rules of decorum that I will review at this time. And I just ask those that are here present today that as we have presenters that are presenting to the committee, to just please remember to be respectful of the people that are testifying. And we, as I said, we're not making any action today, but when there is an opportunity for that, we will give full due process to the people to be voice to be heard. So some rules for you to please consider. Each person that is testifying before a committee shall state his or her name, who they represent, and their special interest in the matter being heard. There are no food or drinks permitted in the auditorium. Please silence your cell phone. All questions or comments must be directed through the committee chair. So that might be new for some of the committee members. Just when you do want to speak, when you turn your button on your microphone on, we can see the red light. And so if you say, Madam Chair, we will recognize you, and then you would make your comments through us. The committee chair shall be referred to as Madam Chair. No one is to disturb another in a speech by hissing, coughing, spitting, speaking, or whispering to another. No demonstrations or clapping. No person may use indecent language with reference to the body or its members. In debate, a person must confine remarks to the question before the House and avoid personalities. It is not the person but the measure that is the subject of debate, and it is not allowable to arraign the motives of a member, but the nature or consequences of a measure may be condemned in strong terms. Any person who willfully disrupts a meeting to the extent that orderly conduct is seriously compromised may be removed. And the committee chair may set time limits for the purpose of giving all interested parties opportunity to testify within a given time frame, if the time constraints are applied equally to all participants. So with that, the rule of the expectation of the rules of decorum, I will turn the discussion back over to Representative Giddings.
Thank you, Madam Governor. All right, the goal of the task force for today is we just want to define what critical race theory is and social justice ideology, and then over that, critical theory in general. And so when you look at the agenda, there's going to be lots of discussion about really capturing it with a definition. The task force is going to meet 3 additional times, the last Thursday in June, July, and August. The following meeting, we're really going to dig into K through 12 and then higher education and have examples. We're going to hear testimony from the community and teachers. And then the last meeting, we're going to come together as a committee and really focus on some courses of action and some recommendations that we have. So I think it's going to be very productive, and it's going to be great for our communities, for the state of Idaho, and I'm looking forward to it. Early Childhood Development Grant, where critical theory was being promoted. And then we started hearing about examples in K through 12. I personally received examples from some substitute teachers in the local valley. And then we also had a lot of concerns for it being taught and advocated for in higher education. So there was a deep dive into how much money was being spent in higher education. Initial indications, we saw about $20 million being spent specifically on social justice ideology here in Idaho. With the initial childhood grant, we were able to kill it in the House, so to stop the teaching of critical race theory. And then we were able to pause the other K through 12 education budgets while legislators worked together to pass a bill that would stop some of the critical race theory in our education. And I'm pulling up that bill specifically because I'm going to have a copy of it all for you after when we have the break, so you can reference it as we're going through this. And once we as the state of Idaho really led the way on that legislation. And it put a pause on what we can do in our education here in Idaho, but there are still some concerns. And so I think that's something that we will also address with the committee.
It's always dangerous to give a professor a microphone and unlimited time, or at least more time than he was expecting. But so what I'm going to try to do today is just talk to the committee and to the people present about where critical race theory has come from. And I'm going to try to give maybe a history of civil rights in the last 50 years, since the Civil Rights Act in a way too, I think in order to situate the contemporary understanding or problem of critical race theory. So here goes. Critical race theory seemed to come like a fire bell in the night. It was adopted all over by corporations, statements in allegiance to those who adopted critical race theory came from school districts and elite schools, Tony elite schools all over the country. And conservatives started to see it as a threat. People on the left started to see it as a great opportunity and an instance of progress. Policies started to pop up in the waning days of the Trump administration. There were bans put on trainings on critical race theory. Immediately when the Biden administration came in, they reinstated, or I should say rescinded those executive orders of the Trump administration. So something's up, and it seems like an important thing. But I want to maybe tamp it down a little bit and before building it up, because there's a lot of names for these things, and there's a lot of things, a lot of ideologies floating around. We hear things about critical race theory. We hear things about critical theory. We hear things about identity politics. We hear things about cultural Marxism or social justice or multiculturalism. And what I'm going to try to argue is that that's all the same old song. Those are all the same ideologies because they boil down to one, maybe two very simple propositions. And then they have different kind of dressings around those simple propositions. And the simple proposition is what I'm going to call, over the course of my time, the reigning civil rights ideology. And I'm going to keep talking, using those words, the reigning civil rights ideology. Our reigning civil rights ideology is based on the idea that all disparities between groups are traceable to discrimination, and that those disparities would disappear under conditions of genuine liberation.
Professor Yenor,
Yeah.
I'm going to just ask you to pause, please, sir. And we're just going to ask that all signs be removed from the committee room. So if you have a sign, if you'd go ahead and please just take it out to the back of the room.
Free speech?
All right, thank you. So there's these.
We'll have order in the committee room, please. No applauding. Thank you. All right, and go ahead and carry on.
All right, thank you. So just to review, I guess, where we were, our reigning civil rights ideology is made up of these two propositions. One, that all disparities are traceable to discrimination, and that those disparities would vanish under conditions of genuine liberation. Now, there is a lot to unpack in these two propositions, and my goal is to unpack it. This idea, our reigning civil rights ideology, has been around and really has been governing policy in this country for over 50 years. It contains a radical critique of our free institutions and some of our really necessary institutions. There's not that much special about critical race theory as opposed to these other schools of thought. They all boil down to those two propositions. They are all animated by our reigning civil rights ideology. And I think the question for us, the most important question for us, is why are they now winning the day? They've been around for 50 years. Why now? So I'm going to try to give an account of that. We'll see how it goes. So first of all, I have to remember I'm front back on the printing. So I want to try to, as I say, unpack those principles of our reigning civil rights ideology. And once again, I'm trying to do this based on a very sympathetic understandings of the writings of those like Kendi and Marcuse, who have articulated these things over the course of time. So this is going to sound weird, but I'm taking our reigning civil rights ideology. It's made up of 5 different things when you look at it. First of all, it contains the contention that our free institutions and ideas are infused with racism, sexism, homophobia. They appear to be neutral, but they're really infused with these secret ideologies. Second, that all of those institutions, like equal protection of the laws, are really masks for power structures in law and opinion that oppress disfavored minorities and privilege dominant groups. They oppress disfavored minorities, blacks, immigrants, women, homosexuals, Muslims, etc., and they privilege dominant groups, white, male, heterosexual Christians, and by the way, 4 for 4 for me. And so that's the second proposition. Third, the oppressors are fundamentally and irredeemably evil, while the victims of the oppression are good and pure. Third, a transformation in the country could only come about by dismantling and stigmatizing the institutions of the oppressor class and weakening its will to continue the old ways. And then fifth, a new world of social justice will be characterized by equity, diversity, and inclusion once that old order collapses. And if you take these 5 propositions, you can explain almost every controversy that happens in our culture wars. Take, for example, the recent effort, I think successfully adopted in California, to drop the SAT from admission standards in higher education. SAT looks like a meritocratic institution. It looks like it's judging people based on their aptitude, which is what the A stands for. And it's a particular kind of aptitude. It's scholastic. It looks like it, but there end up being racial discrimination, or racial disparities in the test results. Asians do better than whites. Whites do better than Latinos. And Latinos do better than blacks. And these disparities have continued really since it's been administered. So it looks like it's objective and neutral, but it ends up giving rise to disparities. How are we to understand those disparities? They could be traceable to different priorities. They could be traceable to different family structures. I would argue that those things are actually important in understanding those disparities. But those critics, those adopters of the civil rights ideology, say that it's traceable to discrimination. That is, the results of the test reflect systems of oppression that the disfavored groups have had to suffer from. Poorer schools, poorly funded schools, poorer families, all of that is part of the system that gives rise to disparities. So what must be done? Next stage, number 4, that old test admission processes need to be transformed. They need to be transformed and dropped. And new admission standards, we'll call them socially just admission standards, must be adopted. And so we're not going to have a holistic account of who comes in and into universities and who is not allowed to come into universities. So just that one controversy with the SAT being dropped by the California higher ed and other institutions of higher education around the country, you see all the marks of all the principles of our reigning civil rights ideology manifest. And it doesn't only apply to race, it applies to many things. It applies to sexual disparities. This is kind of where I do most of my research on this matter. But just to give an example, why are there so few women engineers? Well, it looks like the admission process to becoming an engineer is an objective one. There are criteria to get in. There are classes to get in. You can just choose to be an engineer or not choose to be an engineer. All of that choice seems to be a neutral principle. But we end up seeing that 80% of engineers in almost every kind of engineering are men, and 20% are women. That must be traceable to systems of oppression, or systems of patriarchy, as they might say in feminist literature. They would say things like this: girls are discouraged from math. They would say that math teachers try to channel them into different kinds of professions instead of math. That they've been encouraged by their families to play with people and not things. And all of the accumulation of all those different experiences, which could have been different, equals the 80-20 disparity, and it's traceable to that patriarchal socialization that they have suffered over the course of their lives. What to do? Transformation. Transformation of the engineering profession so it's more friendly to those with different talents, maybe less math-oriented, more personal, in order to bring people in. And then we will have social justice engineering. Whether a bridge would stand up is another question. It's nevertheless the approach that you see on all of these disparities, and I could really go into them, like almost every facet, as I say, of the culture war is fought on these grounds. And once you see this reigning civil rights ideology, once you identify it, you can see it everywhere. You can see how deeply embedded those ideas have been in our culture and our language for almost all of our lives. So what's in a name? We call it critical race theory or critical theory today, but all those theories are critical. They're all critical. Identity politics is critical, multiculturalism is critical, because what does critical mean? Critical means that what appears to be true is not really true. It's a mask. It hides a genuine reality of power structures or power differentials. Critical theory is really only different in two ways, I would say. First, it is more pervasive. It doesn't limit itself to race and sex, as almost all of the other versions did. It expands to other areas, and you'll see this in the Lindsay book. It expands itself to things like fat studies and disability studies. It explains disability in terms of critical theory. And really, no one had done that before it was applied. And then the second way is that I think it's a little bit more radical on the back end, but I don't think that that's really a difference in principle. I think it's just a difference in kind of time sequence, which I'll get to as we go forward. So I'm going to be referring to it as our reigning civil rights ideology, not critical theory, and I'll conclude by calling it social justice ideology for a reason that I'll give you later on. But right now I want to track the rise of our reigning civil rights ideology. For many of us, this is the story of our lives. It's the story of what's happened over the course of our lives. Once again, just going to try to explain it and try to be historically accurate in doing it, because there's really no reason to make it up. So, and I think the story about where it comes from starts in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And there was a genuine debate about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Of course, there was a previous debate on whether or not it should pass, but once it passed, there were two pervasive readings of the Civil Rights Act of 1984. One reading suggested that only individual discrimination was made illegal by the Civil Rights Act. So a person who owns a hotel would not rent to a black man. He would have violated the civil rights of that black man, and therefore he would be subject to the oversight and fines from the EEOC, the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, or something akin to that. Others thought, and this happened almost immediately, that when there are disparities between groups, the Civil Rights Act is triggered. And the debate between those who interpreted the Civil Rights Act on an individualistic basis and those who interpreted it on a, we'll call it the reigning civil rights basis, continued for about 4 years. But in 1968, the Equal Opportunity Employment and other agencies of the government got behind our reigning civil rights ideology. And this came about in various different ways. In hiring, it led to racial quotas or goals and timetables. In contracting, it led to minority and women set-aside programs so that they would, as they say, have an opportunity. In higher education, it led to admission quotas, initially affirmative action as the leading edge of this reform. And at each stage, the United States Supreme Court blessed those interpretations. The United States Supreme Court got behind set-asides, got behind hiring quotas, got behind affirmative action. But in K through 12 education, our reigning civil rights ideology came in a different form. It came in the form of what they called, its advocates called, multiculturalism. And since education is our emphasis, I think it's probably something we need to talk about in some detail because this is not well understood. There is a gap between the races in education. How are we to understand it? That's the question. The old idea, and I might even say the old liberal idea, is that the gap in education between blacks and the rest of the population is caused by what was called cultural deprivation. What cultural deprivation meant is that they had been kept outside the mainstream of American society by discrimination laws, by discriminatory practices, and racial attitudes. And efforts need to be made to bring them up to the level of the rest of the country. Blacks did poorly in math education, so they need remedial programs. Black children were more likely to have families that weren't intact, so they needed preschool or Head Start. This was an attempt to make up for their cultural deprivation. As I say, that's the old understanding. Advocates came to believe that the idea that blacks were culturally deprived was blaming the victim. It implied that black culture was inferior. So they put forward a new model to understand the gap. And that new model they called cultural difference. The father of multicultural education, whose works are little known but very important, is a man named James Banks. Here's what he says about difference and deprivation. The cultural difference paradigm, which he advocated for, maintains that ethnic minority youths often do not achieve well in school, not because they have a deprived culture, but because their cultures are different from the culture of the school. The school should therefore, and here's the key words, modify the education environment to make it more consistent with the cultures of the ethnic minority, end quote. The cultural difference paradigm demands the modification of the education environment. We're not going to demand that people rise to the level of the civilization as it existed before. We're going to try to respect each civilization equally with its limits and with its promises. And the school must be rearranged in order to achieve such things. Now, respecting cultural difference, that's a big-time project. It's very ambitious. I would say it's an endless project. I would even say that it's a rolling revolution in the practices of everything that happens within a school. They might start by celebrating minorities, adopting things like Black History Month, or Women's History Month, or Gay Pride Month. They might continue by deconstructing the old idea of achievement. They might stop teaching about the importance of family life or being on time, because that would suggest a lack of respect for cultural differences. And this cultural difference approach was really first adopted in states in the middle of the 1970s, in Iowa in 1975. It became central to the accreditation standards of schools by the early 80s. It's an approach that was around from, say, 75 until now. And it's been embedded in our practices for about 40 years. But there's a problem. It did not yield equality. The gaps remained. We respected cultural differences, we modified the education environments, but the gap persisted. And this is where critical theory comes in. The idea that the environment needed to be reconstructed has always been with us. But with critical theory, a more radical turn in the idea of reconstructing our environment comes to the fore. You can go back to the 1960s and find critics of imposing Western or white norms in family life onto the black community in America. That's always been considered a problem since the reigning civil rights ideology came about. No one ever suggested abolishing the family as a result until basically 2018. And I think we have the Black Lives Matter About Us statement where they advocated abolishing the family. So the critique of holding minorities to the supposedly white standard has been around for, as I say, 50 years. But a more radical turn comes from critical theory, where they're taking the idea and they're more willing to abolish this, that is, say, family, the police, or something like that. Okay? So I think it's a more radical doctrine, but it grows naturally out of the soil that was tilled in the 40 years or so before it arose. And this leads us to what I think is the most difficult part of understanding and reacting to our reigning civil rights ideology today. It is very moralistic. We should never call it postmodern. Never. It has a big-time ethic that it is seeking to promote. It has a big-time understanding of what the common good in a country is. It is not postmodern. Once again, let's go to James Banks. The major goal of multicultural education is to change the total education environment so that it promotes a respect for the wide range of cultural groups and enables all cultural groups to experience equal educational opportunities. All the buzzwords and the main concepts of our reigning civil rights ideology in the critical theory form are present in what James Banks says there. We could look at Mayor McLean's commission from last year and see all the buzzwords come from that. We can look at Boise State's Diversity Commission from 2017. We'd see all of these things. We can look at corporate trainings. We'd see all of these things traceable to what Banks is talking about, which is how to change the total environment so that it promotes respect. Sounds like a good idea. How do you change the total education environment? It seems like a big job. Today, there are several elements of our attempt to change the total education environment. Our new language will speak of diversity, equity, inclusion, identity, recognition, respect, and openness. These terms will infuse politics with a new morality. They will infuse our educational system with a new morality. We're going to drop the dry old language of liberalism, private versus public, and we're going to recognize that everything is public. And we're going to demand consistent behavior in terms of this new morality. As I say, it infuses our politics with a new morality, a morality that emphasizes these words: diversity, equity, inclusion, identity, recognition, respect, and openness. And this new moral politics may have problems. It may undermine civic friendship and political life, but we have to give it its due. They demand the common good. They speak the language of the common good. And it is my contention that opponents of critical theory must also speak the language of the common good in order to win the debate. So let us understand, insofar as we are able, to understand this new idea of the common good. I'm going to kind of do something backwards. I'm doing this spontaneously, so we'll see how this goes. There was a controversy in Canada, in a little village, that's very interesting and illustrative of, I think, the new understanding of the common good. This happened in 2007, but it can happen anywhere. It's just a very representative sample. Some refugees were being relocated by the Canadian government to this kind of local, this rural village. And it was very conservative, practicing Muslims. And the town folks decided to put up a newspaper ad telling them how to behave. And now, the newspaper ad went something like this: "We swim together, men and women, in public pools. And if you demand that we conform to, change our rules to respect your ways, we will not do it." Now, this is one of these classic examples. We try to be religiously tolerant, and we also want to uphold sexual equality. These two things come at loggerheads in this particular debate. And Canada didn't know what to do. So they named a big commission. And a big philosopher was the head of it. Can you believe that? They put a political philosophy guy in charge of some sort of task force, or on a task force. And so they established this task force. They put a political philosophy guy on top of it. And they sit here and wring their hands for 2 years trying to figure out what to do. And they end up saying, "No, can't you both lose?" Yes, there's a way you can both lose. We're going to say that you shouldn't be so mean to them, and we're going to say to the Muslims, you shouldn't be so sexually inegalitarian. But we're not going to make either of you change. We're just going to badger you. We're going to change the curriculum in schools to try to get each of you to change. We're going to fund interest groups that will pressure you to change. And we think that if we come back here in 50 years or 40 years, the Muslims will move closer to the residents of that rural town, and the residents of the rural town will move closer to respecting difference. And the hope was that with sufficient oversight, sufficient training, we can pursue the common good. And I think if you take that episode and you recognize Canada's response to it, you can understand what's going on with social justice education in America. Okay? It cultivates respect. It does this in a number of ways. We're going to give honor to those that we say have not been honored in the past. History months, Pride months. We're going to stop celebrating the achievements of our own history as much. That will bring some up and bring some down. We're going to advocate for equity. Equity is often thought of as equal outcomes, and I think that that's kind of a halfway decent definition. We should really understand equity as equal status. Everyone will have equal status. And that means that the dominant group has to come to have less status, and that the formerly aggrieved groups must come to have more status. We're going to celebrate sojourner truth. but we'll ignore George Washington. We'll celebrate Florence Nightingale, but ignore Abe Lincoln. Equity means equal status. Diversity means the aggrieved get to make the rules in the name of the new common good. Inclusion means remaking the environment to be, as it is said, more welcoming, to give voice to diverse ethnic, racial, and language communities, and different sexual communities too. Now that might mean things like establishing special offices for formerly aggrieved minorities, such as an LGBTQ center on campus, or a women's center, or an African American studies program, or Latinx studies program. It may mean that. It may mean decolonizing the curriculum, that is, making the books that are read less representative of the history of our tradition and more representative of minority voices. It may mean that, at some level, aggrieved minorities are beyond criticism, and those who criticize them might be told to shut up, or that they're in violation of community norms or shared values, or maybe, as happened in Canada, hate speech codes. So all of these words, they have a new moral content that reflect a new understanding of the common good. It's an ethic of diversity and inclusion. It is explicitly anti-freedom. It is explicitly anti-civilizational tradition. And it's this goal, this understanding of the common good, that is called social justice. The goal of all of these movements, identity politics, multiculturalism, critical race theory, critical theory, is social justice, understood as solving the problem of that rural Canadian community by decreasing the difference and encouraging more respect. Politically, how does social justice come into being? It's going to require administrative hectoring and a transformation of the education environment. Endless interest groups will be funded by the government to change those who need changing. And the goal will be, as I say, the achievement of social justice, where everyone drops their old ways and adopts the new way. Everyone will be more alike. It is not really open because it is closed to some. Now, what I would suggest is that we need to understand these standards of social justice in distinction with the standards of civilization. Standards of civilization include things, but this is not an exhaustive group, like the celebration of achievement, scientific discovery, the defense of the family, a defense of private property, the idea that contracts are the best basis to arrange an economy on, Christianity. Those are the standards of civilization, and under that view, the hope is to rise everyone to the level of civilization. The standards of social justice, in distinction with that, where we say diversity, respect, and inclusion are our watchwords, points toward a new vision of humanity where all these distinctive traits are dropped and human beings converge on their more basic level of humanity. And I would suggest, in closing, that civilization and social justice ideology are in endless conflict with one another. You can't have both. You have to choose. The people of Idaho have to choose, the people of the country have to choose, the people of Canada have to choose. But it's a big fork in the road, and it's good that the task force is here to investigate the nature of each path. Thank you.